Hello, welcome to Taking Liberties, episode 2 for season 5. My name is Lee. I am in Western Australia. This week I am joined by Vickers in Canberra.
Yo.
And Zeev in Melbourne.
G'day.
And this week we're going to do a wrap-up of Trump year 1. We've passed, it's a week out from the 1 year anniversary of his inauguration. And we're also going to talk about that wonderful topic that never gets talked about ever at all. It's so silent. It's Australia Day. Specifically, we're going to talk about an article that came out by Sherry Sufi on Australia Day about the Mabo decision and sort of English common law, and there's a bunch of different aspects. So basically, we're going to talk about whether settlement was necessary for native title. That's what the article's about. So let's start off with Trump year 1. Obviously, it's been... I don't think it's underestimating to say it's been a crazy year. I don't think anybody's quite seen a single year of politics quite like the one we've seen. And maybe, depending how you feel about it, it's good that there's another 3 years, or it's horrifying there's another 3 years. So what are everybody's thoughts on year 1 of Trump?
I think having another 3 years is going to be fantastic. So I'm actually reasonably impressed with certain areas. So, like, for example, I think in the space of foreign policy, right, it's interesting. Despite the fact that he's technically doing a lot more saber rattling, the actual cause of that has been, first of all, North and South Korea are now participating together at the Winter Olympics, right? Mm-hmm. There have been some notable gains. Another one is the situation in Iran, where Iran's backing down. People are genuinely afraid of what he says instead of what he does, right? And that's actually prompting the world to ironically end up becoming a safer place, which is kind of weird because the doomsday clock has moved a minute forward.
I'm not sure I can agree with that assessment. First of all, because North Korea and South Korea playing in the Olympics together doesn't indicate that North Korea has really changed its tack in any way other than the most window dressing type sense, in my opinion.
As opposed to the last 20 plus years where they weren't even doing that.
Yeah.
Oh, well, they ran an industrial facility with the South Koreans for like 10 years?
Yeah, that is actually significant, I would say. I mean, they still shoot defectors because someone tried to leave and, they shot him. So, I mean...
I'm happy to take baby steps. This is a situation where I'm saying I think we're getting in the way of perfect getting in the way of it.
Yeah, I mean,
I think it's a very tiny baby step, and I think it's questionable that we can attribute it to
we talked a fair bit about this a couple of episodes ago, so yeah, maybe if people want to sort of hear our full thoughts on North Korea and Trump's involvement in that, maybe we can refer people to that. But yeah, sorry, keep going, Zeev.
The other point to make is that in terms of economic policies, I think he's obviously cut taxes, which is a good start, but other than that, he's been fairly...
He hasn't cut spending.
Mediocre. Yeah. No. As I said, he's fairly mediocre otherwise. He hasn't really made the case for lower government spending or for really much in the way.
On the economic front, I actually think he's been quite abysmal. So he's increased tariffs, particularly on solar, and it looks like he is an old school protectionist with regard to that particular area.
Which is what he said before the election. Like, that's not a surprise.
And he also pulled out of a trade agreement.
Yeah.
Yes, but I mean, solar is one relatively minor area of the American economy, so I think we can kind of breathe a sigh of relief that we haven't seen massive tariff walls across the entire American economy grow up, because that would be the worst case scenario. And so he hasn't been as bad as expected there. He has been pretty bad on migration, although not quite as bad as he promised to be. Like, he promised a full Muslim ban, but instead he's just banning people from certain countries to some extent from entering. So,
but although he is deporting fewer people than Obama did.
Well, that's because Obama set records. I don't think many people...
The thing about that is that it's also a product of immigrant inflow into the country and outflows. So it's not necessarily because he's changed policies in any way from Obama or made his his departmental officials less strict in any sense that they're not. It's just because there are fewer around, and that's a product of.
So that's actually something I really like. Wouldn't it be great if, without actually changing policy, you could somehow scare people away, and that would like keep the little racist happy?
That's
right.
I would much rather governments do that than the alternative, which is actually pass legislation.
Well, he has passed some legislation and made some executive orders that have made it harder for people to come to the United States, and may lead to the deportation of many, many people unless they're stopped, particularly people from, I think we discussed it last week, Haiti and other places.
Yeah.
So, there's definitely some appalling things that he's done, and we'll see if he manages to carry out his agenda in that regard. We don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. To the foreign policy side of things, I think the erratic nature of Trump is not helpful, because one of the things that you want in relationships between countries is a sense of like knowing where things are going to go. So I think the fact that Trump, what I probably said at the time, I actually meant to listen back to our episode when we was first inaugurated about what our thoughts would be of a Trump presidency. I think I probably said something along the lines of, we don't know how it's going to play out because we don't know what Trump thinks. And I think that's still largely true. I think in every aspect of his presidency, he has confirmed that he really has no idea what he's doing. He has no understanding of what the job entails. He doesn't know what it takes to be involved in politics. He's actually less involved in politics than I thought he'd be. Like, he essentially has done himself nothing more or less to promote any agenda of any sort. And so in foreign policy...
I'm not sure I go that far.
Well, I mean, so his big policies... Because, Obama, right? The guy's a dickhead, but, when he sold a policy, you look at how he went about Obamacare, he spent months in the lead-up doing every single speech, and he'd do dozens of them about specific policy details about Obamacare. He'd go out and defend his policy, he'd go out and defend his proposals.
Yeah, he'd grandstand.
He'd grandstand, and which, that's a large part of the presidency is the bully pulpit. He's just standing and talking. What has Trump said in defense of any of his policies? I mean, yeah, he's on Twitter talking about how great he is, but you couldn't get him to talk about the details for longer than about 20 seconds. He really doesn't have that in him, I don't think, which is not necessarily a problem, because I like governments doing less. The problem with foreign policy is the Trump has a lot of ability just to do stuff without people's permission. So, waking up one morning, not liking that some Syrian kids died, and just start shooting missiles into Syria because he can. So, I mean, in that regard, I think it's instability is not good. At least with Hillary, you would have known that she wanted to fight in everything, and she would have made some tentative grasp towards Congress to get them on board for whatever crazy war she wanted. I'm still not entirely sure that we won't wake up one day and find ourselves in World War III because Trump just woke up shitty and decided to start shooting stuff, and then we have big problems.
I'm actually fairly certain that won't happen because he won't get approval from Congress.
Congress doesn't give a crap about their constitutional responsibilities to be involved in war. The ship on which they had a say in what happens sailed about 18 years ago, and particularly with everything to do with the war on terror, the notion that Congress is going to have an active role in deciding when we go to war and who we go to war against, it's just non-existent. They've just completely abdicated their role. So I mean, that's my take on foreign policy in terms of the economics. Okay, he signed an order saying let's reduce regulation, and I think the growth of regulation has still been stalled, I think that's a good thing. Whether that leads to some sort of agenda, which you pointed out, which is cutting spending, that's a whole separate question, and I don't see it happening.
He's not going to cut. He's not going to cut spending at all.
No. Well, he doesn't believe in it.
He doesn't believe in it. If you take a look at it, those tax cuts. Now, tax cuts are something I'm in huge favor of, but the entire point of tax cuts is that you get the government to do more with less.
Yeah.
Right, which is meant to be the other part of that equation, and it doesn't look like he's even remotely interested in that side of the equation.
No, he wants to spend more.
He's going to cut the spend.
If you were to say, what about he said before the election, he's never going to touch entitlements. his budget included more spending on military. Well, that's basically the entire federal budget is entitlements and military spending.
Well, there's other parts.
He's
not.
But it's like 75% of the budget. Like,
yeah,
I know.
Those are the three big parts.
Yeah,
those are three major parts. He has signalled unhappiness with other much smaller parts of the budget and budgetary spending.
I know. So, I think one of the things he did was cut the EPA.
Yeah,
sure.
Which is, to be fair, the EPA cutting the EPA in the US makes a lot of sense. They don't actually do anything other than publish reports.
Well, and also, I mean, I suspect that more through kind of the bureaucratic process, they can make life very difficult for people, and particularly when it comes to legal action. You know, EPA being sued and EPA suing people. You know, a less activist EPA is probably like a good thing if you are trying to build a big thing. You know, if you want to use land anywhere, it's probably a good thing. So, and that's probably all right.
Yeah, one of my favorite things about the EPA in the States was they made history. Well, they made like a big song and dance about proving secondhand smoke in court, and then subsequent courts have overturned their paper because they found. If you don't know this, you should go up and read up about the EPA secondhand smoking paper. Yeah. There were movies made about it, and then it was quietly pushed off to the side after it was found that there were bad methodological reasons for how they pushed that in, and it was basically a failure on a large part of quality checking inside the EPA as to why they ran with that. So yeah, there's it's not a very
Okay, so there are a few areas where he's perhaps done some good, and a lot of areas where he hasn't. So,
can I just quickly just comment on the notion of him doing good? So, I think he's been benignly negligent. Well, no, I wouldn't even say benign. I think he's just been negligent. Like, because he has no ideas, and he sits and apparently watches TV for like 8 hours a day. He's just not involved in the process. So, like, is
that why you wanted to have the fake news award?
Maybe.
Well, I mean, this is one of the things. Like all of everything to do with the White House is always anonymously sourced. So there's always an element of, can you really believe this? But certainly the stream of consistency in saying that he spends like he doesn't start work till 11 a.m. because he's in his bed or in his office watching TV, and then he goes home at 6 p.m. So like in that regard, that sounds kind of more libertarian because like he literally just has less time in his day to screw things up. And since he doesn't care about things
his
in general,
contact hours are 11 to 6.
Yeah, which is pretty. I mean, it's a pretty good gig if you can get it. Like if you want to spend a lot of time doing nothing, and he spends every weekend in Florida or whatever. So, he's not spending a lot of time doing work. So, I would sort of push back at the notions he's doing good. I'd just say that he's doing nothing, and that some of the people he's hired happen to be okay. And then that's kind of maybe leading to some good outcomes. So sorry, I totally hijacked what you were about to say, Zeev. So just to make that point.
Oh, okay. Well, look, you may be right on that. I don't know. The point I would make is that the disadvantage of him even cutting taxes, if there is one, I think, is that, and I think we've mentioned this before, is that he's kind of this archetypal villain in a way, the archetypal kind of crony capitalist man who will game the system to get every advantage he can for himself personally. And for a person like that to be passing taxes and cutting regulations, from an economic perspective, fine, great. But from a public relations perspective, there's no better villain to cast. As the for a person who wants to suggest that those are bad outcomes and bad policies. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would be interested to know if you search for references to Ayn Rand, villain, and Donald Trump, like how often that comes up, because I suspect people will say that a lot because Ayn Rand is similarly villainous. The thing is, Ayn Rand would have hated Donald Trump, hated him with a passion. Because he's a crony capitalist. He wants to steal widows' homes to build limos, and he's relied on subsidies, and he's a hack. He's a fraud.
He's gamed.
Yeah, he's
gamed the system in all manner of ways. Yeah.
Wait. Hang on. You don't actually have to imagine that. you should read her speech against Ronald Reagan.
Right.
Right. She actually wrote lots of speeches. Sorry, there was one of her last speeches was on Reagan, but she wrote lots and lots of essays, basically denouncing his behavior, saying, tax cuts without cutting and spending. Most of it was related to his approach to taxes,
Right.
and that he wasn't really reducing the size of government, which is actually a legitimate criticism. Reagan technically did not decrease the size of the U.S. government.
No. And in some parts of it, he increased it substantially, like the military.
Yes.
Yeah. So, should we talk about kind of the cultural response to Trump? Do you guys have any thoughts on that? I mean, particularly...
Yeah, actually...
particularly on the right, or in libertarian circles, so the left hate him with a passion.
Yes. But that's
maybe
not
justifiably so. Yeah, not unusual, but I think more than usual.
But actually, what is in my mind, what's actually the unusual thing? Okay, so this happens in America every time, right? Like when George Bush won, the anti-war left rose, right? A grassroots movement to stop, not the anti-war movement. Sorry, it started off with people against the GOP. Yep. It was mostly full of people who were opposing evangelical growth in schools, right? That's where it began. And then eventually, once Iraq and Afghanistan started, it also included the anti-war left, and that kind of grew. That was the groundswell of movement that came up into place with Obama, right? And they suddenly vanished when Obama came into play, right? Despite the fact that those issues very much existing.
Yeah.
Similarly, the conservatives had a growth in the Tea Party movement, right? Now, the Tea Party movement grew grassroots. They really focused on winning local elections, and that became part of the groundswell that eventually ended up feeding the Trump sales, right? And that's what led Trump to victory. Now, the interesting thing is, if you take a look at the Women's March, if you take a look at Black Lives Matter, if you take a look at all these opposition groups that have started on the left, they are not doing any grassroots activism. In fact, they're quite painfully going against grassroots activism. Right, they're not really doing it, and like if you take a look at like the effect of that in the elections they had last year, right? Given the public unpopularity of Donald Trump, right, it did not translate into the Democrats winning any middle ground areas. They won the areas that the Republicans had won in their groundswell, but so basic small recovery. But they hadn't actually made inroads against the Republicans. The Republicans still have a majority in the Senate. They still have a majority in the House. They still have a majority in the governors.
Yep.
Right? So they haven't, like in that last election, right, unlike in 2010, right, where the Republicans started pushing back enormously, they haven't actually had any groundswell. And it's largely because the grassroots movements that you would see coming out of the opposition aren't actually engaging in the political process. They're actually just shouting at people. And that's the main difference.
I mean, it's still pretty early days for that kind of stuff as well. I mean, the Women's March, I think, is a legitimate grassroots thing. Like, I mean, a lot of people turned out for those march, like, across America. I mean, basically, I think it's some of the biggest marches they've ever seen in terms of numbers.
Yeah, but the message isn't actually coming there, right? The message is just women opposing... Effectively,
sure.
Like, sorry to quote Bill Maher on this, it looked like the equivalent. Sorry, it looked like the real life equivalent of Meg from Family Guy complaining on TV, right? And I thought that, that was pretty, like, the pussy hats and everything, the purple, the pink thing. I just went like, whatever message it is, they're losing it by being a caricature.
Well, I think the difficulty with the Black Lives Matter movement and the Women's March movement is that whatever legitimate claims they have, their messaging is not a form of messaging that is outgoing, as in it's not a positive message that they're selling. They're selling a message that for most people is going to be one that makes them feel bad and perhaps defensive. And by that I mean the Black Lives Matter movement. The obvious implication of that movement is that most people don't think Black Lives Matter, and if you're an average white American, or that's the people they're trying to capture, right? I mean, that's still most people in America are white. I'm just saying, But if you're in that category and that's the message you're hearing, okay, some of you may be committed to civil liberties, and you may think, yeah, that's right. And personally, I think they have a point. But the vast majority of people who don't pick up a newspaper every day are going to hear that message and just be insulted, perhaps, or even and the same with the women's marches in a sense, because they're going to think that perhaps there's something wrong with America now, and again, it's not a positive message that the women's march is sending. It's a negative one of America remains sexist. And they might say, well, no, that's not true. It puts people on the defensive. So that's what I think is the main issue with those two groups, that they're casting a message that is very off-putting to the main people that they're hoping to convince. But that's...
I'm not sure that's necessarily a barrier, because most of politics is negative. Like, most politics is about attacking things. I mean, you think about the Tea Party. It was essentially opposition to Obama as a person, and particularly Obamacare as a policy. That's kind of what sort of crystallized that movement.
But the rallying cry of that movement was "Take back your country," right? As
but it's
take
back it from this Muslim guy born in Kenya.
Well,
it's not like
that would be the outer fringes of that movement, perhaps.
Yeah.
But I don't know if the whole movement was fixated on that.
Yeah, I mean, like, that'd be...
we talk about the grassroots.
The Tea Party was based on yes, that may be true, Lee, but they also had this kind of Americana, white picket fences and the suburbs, fine and lovely. They had that positive image to sell, apart from the negative image that they were projecting.
Yeah.
I mean,
so
I suspect if you go, I mean, if we were at the Women's March, I suspect a lot of the speeches would have been about how America's a great place, how they want a fairer place.
Yeah, you wish.
Blah, blah. Okay,
Maybe.
You're skeptical. That's fine, but like that's.
No, I mean, I can grab Lisa Sassour's speech right now, and you can see exactly how sour it was.
Sure,
right. So that's the organizer's speech.
But I mean, these are broad movements, and some are more sour than others. So
I think these movements were fairly sour. That's the difficulty.
I don't think so.
These particular ones that you've mentioned, but that may not be true of all of the movements. That's the thing. We've named only two, but there are plenty of anti-Trump movements out there, and some of them may be quite positive. So I don't know.
No,
I mean,
look,
let's just be real. Like, does anybody here think that the Republican Party are not going to get absolutely smashed in the midterms this year? Do you guys think that there's any chance that they're going to keep their house?
I don't think they're going to get smashed. I think they'll lose some seats, which is expected, but I don't think it'll be a smashing. I think they'll still maintain the majority by quite a big margin.
Okay.
And I think they'll still hold.
Turnout in the House elections is much lower and much more concentrated on white people. So it's not impossible, but it's certainly harder for the Democrats to win in these elections.
Yeah, but so the big ones I'm looking at are the Senate, and I think the Senate will still remain Republican majority. And I'm pretty sure they're about, I think a friend of mine was doing the analysis. There's roughly 41 seats that are potentially going to switch, mostly in Virginia, Wisconsin, and basically that Rust Belt area.
Yeah.
Those are most likely to switch. And I more or less agree with their assessment. I'd be very surprised to see more than 40 seats switch.
I mean, this midterms is, even more than normal. It's going to be a referendum on Trump, on like the president. I mean, I guess there's always kind of the technical aspect, because I mean, obviously in California and New York, they hate Trump. But like, who cares? They're already Democratic. Like, if the Democrats get more Democratic, that matters less than making those marginal seats count. So I mean,
the thing to bear in,
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, I think they will lose, and I'm expecting that they'll actually probably lose the House, or the Senate, because they like one. They need to lose. One seat. The House have got a bigger margin, but as soon as they lose the Senate, then you have the possibility of impeaching Trump, and that's the one that they want. Like, that's what's going to make it spicy for the Democrats, is if they can have the ability to impeach Trump, then all of a sudden they've got a pretty big weapon in their arsenal to beat Trump around their head with. we should probably move on because otherwise we could probably talk about this. I think the impeachment thing is a topic worth discussing in future. But
sorry, I misread my friend's one. It's sorry, he's outlined 20 potentials.
Okay.
So yeah, it was less than I thought. I doubled the number.
I mean, they've got a pretty big margin in the House. I think they got like a 60 seat or something. So theoretically they may not lose it, but I mean the Senate is pretty tight. It's literally one seat. It's 49 to 51. So.
Yep.
Let's talk about Australia Day. Let's talk about Sherry Sufi's article, which was I think it was in Fairfax in general. It was in Fairfax because I saw it on Sydney Morning Herald's website as well as the WA Today, where essentially he outlines the idea that if Australia had been invaded, then all claim by Indigenous people to the land would have been extinguished. It's only that they were settled that they still have kind of the right to native title. Therefore, it has to be set. Like pushing for the notion of Invasion Day actually is counter to the interests of Indigenous people. I think that's the fair sort of take on his article. I'll try and remember to put a link in the show notes. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sorry.
And then we'll go to the actual lawyer in the group.
Yeah, no. So his actual article was.
I'm sorry. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to correct that. So, inconvenient fact: native title can only exist in Australia if Australia is settled, not invaded. So he basically said, along the lines of Australia can only, the Aboriginal people can only have native title, which is a limited hunting type of license. If the decision was that Australia was settled, not invaded, as per a misunderstanding of the actual Mabo decision. Anyway, continue.
Oh, okay. Do you want to share your thoughts first, or Zeev, do you want to go for it first, since you're actually a lawyer and probably is better placed to talk about these things?
All right. Well, look, the reasoning that Sherry's put forward is very much based on international law, and basically he's saying, well, let's set out his case and then let's dismantle it. So he's saying, look, first of all, international law holds that land that was conquered prior to, I think it was 1945, but I could be off by a year or two there, and I'd need to look at the article specifically. International law holds that land prior to that day, if it was conquered by a Western country or by any country at all, it's simply taken to be conquered. There's no more native title rights associated with it. There's no possible claim in international law to that land. If it was land that was acquired by a nation afterwards, then there are native title rights attaching to it. And if you apply that logic to Australia, then Australia was either settled or invaded in the late 1700s. But if it was invaded, then it follows that there are no claims to native title, and then it follows that claiming that Australia was invaded undermines native title in some sense. So the errors in that argument are, first of all, as Vicus points out as well, English common law doesn't actually have too much to do, especially when it comes to property law, with international law. That's historically speaking and generally speaking. So there are limited exceptions where international law is recognised, but property law has never really been much among them. And what that means in practical terms is that it doesn't really matter whether the land was conquered or whether the land was settled. And as the High Court judges in Mabo pointed out, that's just not relevant. The question is, was the land used and enjoyed in certain ways that are recognisable as property rights, and should they be recognised as such? To which they said yes. Now, you might say, well, that system of native title that they've recognised is pretty limited and unfair to Indigenous people. That's a separate argument, one I have some sympathy with, but separate argument. The other point to mention, of course, is that in a way it doesn't really matter whether international law says one thing or another about whether whether native title should be recognised after 1945 or before it. International law is what states, that is to say politicians, have agreed to amongst themselves as convenient, and which they will sometimes recognise. Okay, but that doesn't mean that what politicians have agreed to as convenient between themselves is morally right or wrong. And that doesn't mean that we should in turn decide whether to recognise native title or property rights in general just because a bunch of politicians have said it's right or wrong to do that. We should, first of all, as a matter of logic and reasoning, decide, well, they've used and enjoyed this land, they were here first, that sounds like a reason to recognise property rights in some sense. Counter-arguments are, well, there's difficulty in tracing their lineage, their descendants. Other people have used and enjoyed the land and they were innocent third parties, right? I mean, 200 years have passed. Fair counter-arguments, but the reality is that there is an argument that international law is irrelevant and that there's been first use and enjoyment of the land.
Yeah, I mean, like I think
that's my take.
Yeah, I mean that's something that I think all three of us have said on the podcast previously about, particularly about native title and its lack of potency and the superiority of sort of real property rights. I mean, I think this whole argument was particularly, I mean, so in the responses, because I'm friends with Sherry on Facebook, and so, you know, obviously I was critical of his article and when he posted it, and then his, you know, people, conservatives in particular, sort of came in and to support his argument, and a lot of them would point to, you know, like these sorts of things, and it's like, well, it's very convenient that the people who want to take the land have an argument to keep the land that they want to take. So Terra Nullius is a great example. It's like, oh, well, we want this land. If we recognise your property rights, we can't take it. Oh, how convenient it is that we just declare that you don't have a real society, a real right to it. You're not civilised enough. Oh, it was such a shame that we can now take your land without feeling bad about it. And similar sorts of things about, you know, this notion of international law, or even the High Court ruling on it. If from a strict property rights perspective, you're saying, well, I mean, it's helpful for our case that Mabo, you know, that these things recognise some of the things that we're supporting. But, you know, if the High Court turned around and said, oh, no, actually, Australia has a justifiable right to take the land. It's like, well, yeah, the government that wants to take the land has a part of its own government saying, yes, we want to do what we want to do. And I think for us who are hardcore property rights people, we would say, well, that's not good enough. You've got a conflict of interest. You're not a neutral arbiter between Indigenous people and the British and then the Australian governments. Like, you clearly have a stake in the outcome, which is your existence is justified by this particular argument. So
my main source of amusement on this is typically you'll get your conservatives arguing, you know, against the international global socialism of the UN and all those organizations. And in this situation, basically what they're saying is this international organization has come up with a way for them to basically crawl back to terra nullius, which is effectively what Sherry's argument is. It's, you know, if you say that it was invaded, then terra nullius applies again. That's what he's trying to get at. And unfortunately, like I was saying with the Mabo case, there's actually a section in there, and I can't remember which judge it was, but he goes through the argument of whether it's settled or invaded, and basically he just goes like, for the purpose of this particular ruling, right? Like, he just goes, they're synonymous. His exact words were, for this particular ruling, they're synonymous. And the reason why he came to that is because he was actually, if you haven't had the chance, please go and read the Mabo ruling. It's actually an interesting read. And if you're a libertarian, you should definitely read it, because the roots of their decision actually come from Lockean principles, which is unusual as fuck for Australia. So, yeah, I mean, seriously, if you want, like,
Locke is the person who first, in relatively modern times, put forward the argument that a person owns land because they first used and enjoyed the land. So it is absolutely, in that sense, a Lockean ruling. And the English common law of property rights is very much based on Lockean principles. I can say that much, which is one of its main blessings. Anyway, Vickers, go on.
Yeah, so like I said, this is the constant source of amusement with Mabo and basically native title, and not just like Aboriginal land rights in general, is the conservative opposition to what is actually something that should be their staple, which is arguing Lockean land rights. And realistically, they revert to all sorts of convoluted arguments. And in this particular case, the worst I've seen, where they're actually appealing to a legal fiction appealing to a legal fiction which the executive branch can make up by itself. I just sit there flabbergasted. I'm just like, this is a really bad argument, and if you applied it in any other area, conservatives would be saying this is bullshit. So, I guess I'm just saying this argument was bad. There are people that knew better for some reason that were pushing this article, and I don't know why.
Well, I think to support exactly what you're saying now, there was a great article on The Conversation. They do a fact check. It came out today. It came out yesterday. And it's called Fact Check: Can Native Title Only Exist If Australia Was Settled, Not Invaded? I'm going to put it in the show notes. So if you want to, it will be on takingliberties.com, takinglibertiesradio.com. We'll have the link there if you want it. And yeah, they basically go through and say the exact thing. They quote Justice Brennan talking about English common law. And
That's
it's a really good
Justice
read.
Brennan, yeah. So, yeah.
So in summing up, it's the Constitution, it's Mabo, it's justice,
it's the
law,
vibe.
it's the vibe.
It's a vibe.
No, that's it. It's the vibe. So I think we'll leave it there. I think we've can't top the castle in terms of solid property rights discussion. So thank you for joining us, everybody.
Actually, before we leave it there, I just want to point out, ironically, that family would have lost their case.
They probably would have, yeah.
Yes, they would have, but nevertheless, that entire film was the quintessential libertarian case. I mean, they've got people of all different backgrounds living together, all of them opposing the government. So it's a cosmopolitan liberalism at its best, and I'm going to write an article about that at some point.
About how they would have lost the case so badly?
No, that's not what I'm going to write about. But I might mention that in passing, actually. That could be a good point to mention.
Well, actually,
anyway.
no, you don't even have to think of it hypothetically. There are loads of cases where people lose battles like this against their local...
There's compulsory acquisition all the time for roads and all of that,
Yeah, so just remember, right, every time you think about that favourite NIMBY policy of yours, the castle would not happen in your world.
Yeah. Alas, it's a good libertarian daydream to watch it. So, Also, like Ghostbusters, the EPA probably would have won the argument. So anyway, that's episode 2 for this season. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll be back again next week. Vickers has got more to talk about electricity because it's Vickers.
We could do that as an after episode, can't we?
I've actually got to go places and do things, but yes, we'll talk about it at some stage. So thanks for joining us, everybody, and we'll be back again next. Like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. Our Facebook and YouTube and iTunes. Thanks.
Toodaloo.